How's everyone doing today?
Very good.
Good morning.
Great. Well, we are very fortunate this morning. We have got Lauren Vahey, who is a lobbyist and knows everything going on in Washington. And she's with the AICPA joining us today. She's going to introduce herself, and I think we're going to have a great session where we learn a lot about all the possibilities that may spring up in terms of the changes with taxes or the PCAOB possible ones. So Lauren, thank you very much for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. As Bonnie said, I'm Lauren Vahey. I'm a director of Congressional and Political Affairs at the American Institute of CPAs. I've been there for about 5 years, and my professional background prior to that is I actually spent about 3 years working for a Republican member in the House of Representatives. And then I spent over 6 years working for Angus King, who is the independent senator from Maine who caucuses with the Democrats over in that chamber. And I say that because it is the rare former staffer or staffer these days who works for both parties and both chambers. So I've literally seen it from every single angle. I've been in the room with some of the most conservative Republicans, and I've been in the room with some of the most liberal Democrats. I am here to talk to you all about what I am framing as kind of the post-election opportunities, and we can go into risks as well, for our profession, depending on different political scenarios. And at this point, it might be a good idea if people would mute themselves, find that mute button and hit that, and then we can continue on. So I just want to take a moment and talk about the fact that we have, I think, 75 days remaining before the election in November. And in the last 2 months, we have seen, just to kind of set the stage, an assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump, which spawned and is still spawning congressional hearings and investigations on the Hill, the selection of J.D. Vance as former President Trump's running mate, which opens up a Senate seat in Ohio and potentially changes the makeup of the Senate Banking Committee because J.D. Vance serves on that committee. We've had the Republican National Convention. We had President Biden's announcement that he was not going to be running again and his immediate endorsement of Vice President Kamala Harris. We had Harris's quick lockdown of the delegates needed to win the Democratic presidential nomination. She then chose dark horse candidate Tim Walz, governor of Minnesota, who, fun fact, my husband worked for when Tim Walz was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. And now we have the Democratic National Convention, which is going to show post-convention probably a bump in the polls for Kamala Harris. It has been the most chaotic 2 months, I think, in any presidential election cycle that I can remember. It is usually not quite this volatile, and I'm going to walk us through how the tumult and that volatility has shown up in respected polls. And I think the volatility and all the attention on the presidential election also underscores how, it's not that legislating is done, but it's that all the attention has turned away from the congressional calendar, and now we are squarely fixed on what is happening in our elections. So back in early July, this was just days after President Biden's disastrous debate with former President Donald Trump, Joe Biden actually registered his best polling to date in early July in a Bloomberg News Morning Consult tracking poll of battleground states. Now, why do we focus on the battleground of the swing states? They're the states that are going to decide the election. In this poll, this is again just days after that debate, Donald Trump led Biden by only 2 percentage points. In a head-to-head race, it was 47% for Trump, 45% for Biden in those swing states. And that was the smallest gap since polling had started in October of 2023. This was a really encouraging swing state poll for Biden. However, it was the only national poll that showed him doing this well, and he still wasn't winning. And I think shortly after this poll, that's when all of the pressure started to mount on real pressure, public pressure on Joe Biden to drop out of the race. So that was July 6th. He drops out of the race. 2 weeks later, we have Kamala Harris almost completely eradicating Trump's lead in the swing states. And we break it down by the swing states. She was riding, and I think she's still riding, a wave of enthusiasm from young Black and Hispanic voters. So the top line here, if you consolidate all the swing states, was that Harris was leading Trump 48% to 47%. That's a statistical dead heat. And that's a stronger showing, obviously, than Biden's 2-point deficit from 2 weeks prior. And then when you break it down by race, you start to see that there are some states where Biden had been doing very poorly compared to Trump, and Harris was making huge gains. So in Arizona, Harris is leading, or was leading at this point, 49 to 47. In Georgia, which should have been and might still be an easy win for Trump, she's actually locked in a dead heat at this point in time with Donald Trump. In North Carolina, which has been a traditionally Republican state with the exception of the Democratic governor recently, you have Harris creeping up on Trump. She has 46% to his 48%. Pennsylvania, this was probably the scariest one for Donald Trump because Pennsylvania is one that he thought, I think if Joe Biden had still been in the race, Trump would have won this state easily, and now that's in jeopardy. She has 46% to his 50%. And then she's beating him in Wisconsin. Again, this is July 30th. So across the swing states they surveyed overall, the gap obviously is still kind of in that statistical margin of error, but the momentum in 2 weeks is astonishing. She pretty much, like I said, wiped out his swing state lead. And she was showing that she might have a clearer path to victory than Joe Biden, who by the time he dropped out, I think it was pretty universally understood that he didn't really have a clear path to victory. So then we jump ahead 2 weeks later. We're now in the middle of August. And the Cook Political Report, which is an amazing kind of polling and data shop, shows that the top line number of Kamala Harris leading Donald Trump by 1 or 2 points stayed pretty much the same, but she was now beating him in a few of the states, or had widened her margin in a few of the swing states from 2 weeks prior. So in Michigan, that's an outlier. Trump actually improved his showing. In Nevada, Trump recaptured the lead under this poll. And then in Pennsylvania, Harris takes the lead. Pennsylvania is kind of a must-win state for both people. And it matters, this momentum matters because she really, her entry changed everything about the election. I think the Republicans prior to this, when Joe Biden was in the race, were really projected to take almost all of the swing states. And within a month, she had eradicated those gains. So I think the takeaway from this, and I'm not going to show you any more polling because I think the next good batch of polling we're going to get comes after the closing of the Democratic National Convention. But if she continues to improve on these polling numbers, particularly in Pennsylvania and North Carolina and in Georgia, she has a couple of very good, clear paths to victory. A Harris win in the White House probably means that House Democrats retake the majority in that chamber. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. We've got 75 days to go. And obviously, I think there's always the chance of what we call an October surprise. Something big happens, it changes the race again. But I feel like we've seen a lot of really momentous and kind of consequential things happen already. And it's hard for me to think of the next thing that would happen that would change, that would flip this race back, where the swing states are leaning more towards Trump than towards Kamala Harris. Okay. So before I go into what I think different election outcomes mean for different federal tax policies, I want to take a step back and talk about what's happened recently in the world of tax on Capitol Hill, because some of what's happened is going to set the stage for what could happen in 2025. So I think we've all been following the Wyden-Smith tax deal. As a reminder, this was the deal that offered up like an expansion and extension of the child tax credit in exchange for some business tax relief and provisions that had expired from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This deal, when it passed the House earlier this year by such a huge margin, 357 to 70 votes, everyone thought, okay, this has a really good shot of passing in the Senate and being signed into law by the end of the year, because everyone kind of got around. It was a bipartisan effort. And I think most people, if you polled them, would say that they actually really like this deal. And then it all started to fall apart in the Senate. And it fell apart for a number of reasons. There were political reasons and there were policy reasons. The political reasons, and they're perfectly fine reasons, are that Republican senators thought, well, why are we going to agree to a deal that now, when we could potentially have the White House, the Senate, and the House next year, when we will have an opportunity to do our own tax bill. So why not wait until we have all of the power and write, a tax bill that includes components of this deal to our liking? And that was the calculation, spring, summertime. And there were some policy issues as well. Senate Republicans had some clear policy issues with the way that the child tax credit calculation was going to be, how it was going to work, and how it might benefit families or parents who had been working and no longer work. And so pretty quickly, Senate Republicans, the leaders at least, and that means Senator Crapo, who's the ranking member on the Senate Finance Committee, the members who are trying to replace Mitch McConnell as the leader of the Republican Party in the Senate, they all come out and said, we're not going to cut a deal. And we're going to wait. So eventually, Senator Schumer realized he wasn't going to get a deal. I think more importantly, Chairman Wyden, the chairman of the Finance Committee, realized he wasn't going to get this deal. And they thought, well, the next best thing to getting a deal is having Republicans in the Senate vote on it and own its failure, meaning Schumer and Wyden and every Democrat knew this bill was going to go down, but they held the vote anyways because they knew they could cut campaign ads on it. And I haven't seen those ads hit the airwaves yet, but they're going to be in the vein of Senate Republicans don't care about working families. So I highlight one section, or I outlined in one section of the deal in red. And this is the provisions that give you a little bit of federal disaster tax relief to certain victims of certain natural disasters. Because the question I keep getting asked is, well, Lauren, the Senate bill died essentially on August 1. Is there any chance that this whole package could be resurrected in a lame duck session? And my answer is no, not the whole package. However, I do think that this federal disaster tax relief could be scooped out of the bill, paired with a few other non-controversial tax issues, and passed in the lame duck session. So I would keep our eyes on that. And when I say a few other issues, there are some Secure Act 2.0 technical corrections that are lingering out there that still need to be done legislatively. And there is language on a tax treaty between US and Taiwan that everyone feels pretty strongly about. So I don't think there's going to be a huge tax bill at the end of the year, but there certainly could be something small that scoops out this part of the Wyden-Smith tax bill and passes it and is signed into law. One of the reasons I think we were all following the Wyden-Smith tax deal is because it was about a $78 billion deal. That's the cost of the deal over 10 years. And it was largely paid for by retroactively ending the Employer Retention Credit Program. I think we've all had enough of this program. It has caused an enormous amount of consternation and frustration. Our membership were some of the earliest people warning clients, warning the Hill, warning the IRS that there was an inordinate amount of fraud in this program. and that we were the ones trying to make sure that clients were doing the right thing, but some of them were unfortunately going to those credit mills and getting bad advice. So this deal picked up on that and proposed an early ending to the Employer Retention Credit Program. We did talk to the staffers who wrote this part of the bill, and we said, hey, that early ending date of January 31, 2024, that's pretty early. Some of our membership may still have clients who have legitimate claims. Is that date movable at all? Let's say you don't pass this bill until 2025. Can we push that date out until, say the day that the bill passes in 2025? And the staffers said no. And they were very firm about it. And they've been telling everyone. And the reason why is, as written, the retroactive ending to the Employer Retention Credit Program raises about $68 billion over 10 years. And what we have learned is, even if we creep into 2025 and the retroactive, ending date stays the same, the revenue score doesn't really diminish. So there's no incentive for staffers to move up that ending date because they don't want to lose their revenue or their offset for this deal. And even though the deal is dead next year, having a revenue raiser that gives you $60 billion over 10 years from this ERC language is going to be really attractive to both Republicans and Democrats when they are hunting for revenue to pay for a tax bill. So I still think it's a matter of when rather than if these proposed Employer Retention Credit Program changes go into effect. The prize for winning the elections is you get the opportunity potentially to rewrite the tax code in 2025. Why? Because almost all of the individual provisions from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expire at the end of 2025, which kind of necessitates a revisiting of a lot of those individual provisions. So I think everyone is pretty excited about the opportunity to touch the tax code in a significant way. I'm going to walk us through 4 different scenarios. And these are going to be different election outcomes between the White House, House, and Senate, and then how I think different tax deals or no deals would come together under those different scenarios. What I want to emphasize here is that the size and scope of the tax bill is going to be decided not just by which party is in power, but by how much. So, for example, if House Republicans maintain their current majority, but they only maintain it by about 4 or 5 seats, and the House Freedom Caucus, which is one of the more conservative groups in the House from the Republican Party, grows their number of members, they could have outsized influence over what a House tax bill looks like. In the Senate, if Kamala Harris wins the White House and Democrats somehow hold on to 50 seats, that would make Tim Walz the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. One Democratic senator or 2 Democratic senators or a small gang of Democratic senators could have outsized control over what the tax bill looks like. So let's walk through these scenarios and talk about those implications. So the first scenario I want to lay out is what I think is the most likely one, and that is where Kamala Harris wins the White House, Republicans win control of the US Senate by about 1 to 3 seats, and Democrats regain control of the House, but they only do so with a very slim majority. Under this scenario, I think we see what I'm going to call a return to 2012. And that is when, at the end of 2012, President Obama had just been reelected to his second term. And the Bush-era tax cuts were about to expire, literally months later. And you had Obama in the White House, John Boehner, a Republican member of Ohio, who was the leader of the House Republican majority, and then Harry Reid from Nevada in the Senate. And they were able to come together, and I think they extended 82% of the Bush-era tax cuts. And they were able to pay for that extension, for the most part, by making some changes to, I think it was the estate tax, and some individual income tax rates, dividend tax rates on what they would term higher income individuals. So under that scenario where we had a Democratic White House, a Republican House, and a Democratic Senate in 2012, they were able to come to a bipartisan agreement and actually extend a majority of a Republican drafted tax bill. And that's kind of the scenario we face again. And so my suggestion is there's a real possibility that with Kamala Harris in the White House, Republicans in the Senate, and Democrats in the House, depending on who leadership is, I think you could see a bipartisan agreement come together at the end of 2025, where you probably close to Christmas time, where they extend a large portion of the individual provisions in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, perhaps for as much as 10 years. There is also a scenario in which they cannot agree and they decide, well, let's just do a short extension of the key provisions, meaning maybe they extend that increase in the standard deduction for a couple of years. Maybe they extend that increase in the child tax credit for a couple of years. And they maybe do a 1 or 2 year extension of the most important policies, mostly in parts that Kamala Harris can maintain that she abided by her pledge to not raise taxes on individuals making under $400,000 a year. And you do like a short-term, very small tax bill, and then we have to revisit this again in 2026. The second scenario that I want to lay out is where Republicans have the trifecta, meaning President Trump wins the White House again, Republicans control the Senate, and Republicans control the House. 2 months ago, I would have told you this was a very, very real and probably the most likely scenario. Now, with Kamala entering the race, I think it's less likely. So what's interesting is that under a Republican trifecta, I don't think we should necessarily expect just a straight line extension of all the individual provisions in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I say that because Jason Smith, who is from Missouri and from actually one of the poorest districts in the House of Representatives, is the Republican chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. And he has been talking pretty publicly about the need to, 1, increase the child tax credit, and 2, raise the corporate income tax rate. He hasn't really thrown out a number. Right now it's 21. I think Donald Trump has said something like, well, let's take it down to 15. Harris and the Democrats would like to see it closer to 28%. But for every percentage increase in the corporate income tax rate, you raise about $100 billion over 10 years. So there's kind of a natural marriage here where you say, okay, I want to boost the child tax credit. And someone says, well, that's good. Boosting a child tax credit by $1,000 per child is going to cost you about $500 to $600 billion over 10 years. And so then there are some Republicans like Jason Smith who are saying, okay, well, let's just increase the corporate income tax rate, by 5 or 6 percentage points. Maybe a little less than that, make a few other choices, and then we can pay for that increase in the child tax credit. Part of me as a former Republican staffer thinks that Republicans are talking openly about wanting to raise the corporate income tax rate. 1, because they recognize the need to pay for at least some of the tax bill, but 2, because Republicans over the last, since I left the House, have become more antagonistic with corporate America. They disagree with some of the choices they're making, particularly in DEI and ESG and sustainability reporting. And they are trying to encourage, for lack of a better word, the Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable and large corporations to focus on basically bringing value back to shareholders and focus on that alone. So I do think if there's a Republican trifecta, there's going to be some really interesting infighting over what to extend from the TCJA if you raise the corporate income tax rate. And then the really hard issue for Republicans, particularly if the Republicans hold the House, is do they go outside of the tax code? Under what is known as a budget reconciliation bill or a tax reconciliation bill, you're really only supposed to include provisions that have a revenue impact, meaning they lose money or they raise money. So interestingly, I do think there's a way to put immigration reform into a tax bill that is a reconciliation tax bill, meaning it moves through both chambers faster than it normally would, and it only requires 51 votes in the Senate rather than 60 votes in the Senate. And there's a way to put immigration reform in there because most immigration reform plans actually have an impact on revenue, the revenue raised, the revenue lost. And I think the House Republicans, just based on their makeup, if they have the majority, are going to have to put things in this tax bill that could derail it in the House. So I'm talking about border security, immigration reform beyond the scope of what the tax bill would allow. There may be some DEI stuff in there. We could see things about education in America. So it's going to be a full year of infighting, I think, before they finally come to agreement. President Trump has shown, I won't say a willingness, but he's shown a real ability to get his party in line. So I think if there's some infighting, President Trump could kind of parachute in from above and say, here's what the plan is going to look like, and everyone falls in line. And then again, we have kind of a Christmas time 2025 tax bill. And then we flip to the third scenario. And this is where Kamala Harris wins the White House, the Democrats win the Senate, and the Democrats win the House, the Democratic trifecta. The only way this happens is if John Tester could lose in Montana, but every other Democratic senator up for re-election or trying to get into an open seat would have to win. And that would create a 50-50 Senate. This is assuming that West Virginia goes to the Republicans, which it will. So there's a possibility that this happens, particularly if Harris can kind of lift some of the Democratic senators that are in vulnerable races who 2 months ago faced tougher races than they do now. But this scenario is where I think you're going to see a really big overhaul of the tax code. Even if Democrats win by only a small majority in the Senate and the House, I think they're going to declare this a mandate to overhaul the tax code in a way that doesn't raise taxes on individuals making less than $400,000 a year, but it's going to be huge. Like the proposed size of this tax bill under the scenario would be in the realm of like $6 to $12 trillion over 10 years. And part of that is because some of the more progressive senators like Bernie Sanders of Vermont are going to say early and publicly, well, I think the tax bill should look like X. And he will do that to try and kind of set the stage or the scope. And then we usually work backwards from there. SALT is going to be a huge area of tension. There are many Democrats, particularly in the House, who really don't want to roll back the cap. It doesn't benefit their constituencies. And I do think under this scenario, we're going to have some agreement on what to do with the corporate income tax rate, raise it, and what to do with OECD Pillar 2. If you're following international tax issues, the Republicans have been pretty publicly opposed to doing legislation that would implement Pillar 2 of the OECD project. But no matter how you slice it, moving legislation to implement Pillar 2 of OECD is actually a revenue raiser in the next couple of years. So I think no matter who's in power, it's going to be really hard to ignore that pot of money if you have to pay for some or all of a tax bill. And what I find really interesting about this scenario is, there's no Democratic senator that comes to mind for me who could kind of play the role that Joe Manchin has played over the last 4 years in moderating the scope and size of different bills. If you remember, the Build Back Better Act as originally proposed was going to be a huge bill, and Joe Manchin managed to narrow the size and the scope of the bill, and he actually got provisions out that would have implemented Pillar 2 of the OECD deal. So when I think of Joe Manchin's leaving the Senate, Senator Sinema from Arizona, who's played a moderating role, is leaving the Senate, who comes to mind? Who would play that moderating role within the Democratic Party in the Senate? Maybe Mark Warner of Virginia, potentially my former boss, Angus King of Maine. But I think particularly since most of these men and women were around in 2017, when TCJA was a completely partisan exercise, and I'm talking about Democrats were not allowed in the room and their voices were not listened to. I think it's going to be, I don't think Democrats are going to be inclined to, one, let Republicans in the room, and two, I don't think they're going to be inclined to negotiate against themselves. I think they're going to go big. All right, so the last scenario I want to talk about. This is kind of my nightmare scenario, but I think it's a real one. You've got, and I say nightmare scenario for tax policy purposes. You have Kamala Harris in the White House, you have a Republican-led Senate, and you have a Republican-led House. And under this scenario, I just don't see how any tax bill gets done at the end of 2025, and here's why. If the Republicans retain their majority, they're probably growing the size of the House Freedom Caucus, those more conservative members. They will not be able to help themselves. They will not be able to control this. They will write a tax bill for their chamber that Kamala Harris simply could not sign into law. Republican senators, it depends on who leads them. Like I said, Mitch McConnell is leaving his post as the Senate majority leader for Republicans. And so if you look at the pictures, I've got John Thune is next to Kamala Harris. I'm sorry, John Cornyn is next to Kamala Harris. He's a longtime senator from Texas running to be the leader of the party. And then John Thune of South Dakota. Both have been or are on the finance committee, both very smart and both more moderate. And then on the far right, that's Mike Johnson, the current House Speaker. But you have to have agreement between the two chambers on what a tax bill would look like. And I think it would be really, I think any agreement they would come to would have to be a bill that Kamala Harris could look at and say, well, I'm really sorry. You didn't raise the child tax credit to a high enough rate. You didn't raise the corporate income tax rate high enough. You did nothing for affordable housing. This is not a good deal for working families. Therefore, I veto your bill if you manage to pass it. So imagine that we're at the end of 2025. Republicans have managed to pass a tax bill through both chambers, and Kamala Harris vetoes it. We now enter 2026 with many of the, with reverting back to a lot of the pre-TCJA individual kind of rates and thresholds. And the SALT deduction cap has disappeared. And that is when, in 2026, I think that there could be an agreement. And the reason why is, as soon as the deduction cap disappears, it kind of creates a new, what we call budget baseline. So Harris, the Republican Senate, and the Republican House could say, okay, we're actually going to come to a deal. It's going to be a bipartisan deal on extending a lot of the individual proportions. And we are going to put a new cap on SALT, on the SALT deduction, but it's going to be $50,000 a year. It scores as a revenue raiser. And so I've been talking about this with tax councils all over town with some of my friends who are much smarter on tax policy than I am. And I'm saying, why wouldn't you, under this scenario, let everything expire? Because you can put a cap on the SALT deduction and claim that you fixed it and raise a bunch of money to pay for all the other priorities in your bill. Because as we know, the hardest part of a tax bill is finding the pay-fors or the revenue. That is my nightmare scenario, because I think you'd have a few years of extreme volatility in the tax code. And then I just want to put this up. This is just a visual representation about some of the individual stuff that is on the table and is set to expire. I think, as you know, the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Republicans on the Senate Finance Committee have put together kind of like working groups or task forces to study the different issues that need to be addressed. And they are also talking about issues outside of the scope of TCJA that might want to be included in a tax bill. But there's obviously a lot on the table. All right, so shifting from different tax scenarios, I know I'm giving you all a lot of information and I apologize, and I'm happy to take questions at the end, to a question that Bonnie actually posed to me. And this was after, Bonnie, you came back from the ASAE meeting in Cleveland, I think, and they were talking about the possibility of, no matter who is in power next year, of a tax bill taking away the tax exempt status for kind of a variety of nonprofits. And I had extensive notes, and I'm just going to kind of speak freely here and say it's not happening. I don't want to discount what AICE is saying. I don't want to discount kind of their threat assessment too much, but I will say, is there bipartisan consensus on going after nonprofit hospitals that now account for 60% of hospitals across the nation that are not providing enough charitable care? Yeah, I think there's definitely bipartisan interest in saying, hey, maybe you don't deserve your tax exempt status, or more likely, we're going to legislatively require you to put X percentage of your operating expenses into charitable care. Is there interest, particularly among the Republicans, in going after institutions of higher education that they think are no longer deserve their tax exempt status for a variety of political reasons or policy reasons? Yes, there's interest. The only way in which I think a tax bill comes after the nonprofit sector in a really aggressive way is if you have that Republican trifecta. And even then, I think it's going to be really hard to accomplish. I have been at the center of fights between the banks and credit unions over the status of the credit unions tax exempt status. I have been at the center of fights over the parking fringe benefit that was, I think, enacted, or the repeal of TCJA, or it was part of TCJA and that was repealed a few years later when everyone was like, well, that was a terrible idea. It kind of comes down to, for me, it's going to be really, really hard for members of Congress to take away the tax exempt status of their golf club and then sit down to fundraise the next day at the same golf club and be like, well, I'm really sorry, folks, but keep giving me money. I don't see that happening. So I just want to clarify and kind of level set. I really don't think that a tax bill is going to come after the nonprofit sector in as aggressive a form as AICE thinks. And AICE is leaning heavily on a report that was written by the Tax Foundation, a very well-respected tax think tank. I look at their stuff all the time. I know a lot of their folks. And they are pointing to a report that was released in June 2024 that said, let's completely remake, let's take away the tax exempt status of pretty much everyone in the nonprofit sector, aside from churches, and that'll raise a ton of money to pay for a tax bill. This report was written by the former president. He is no longer the president of the Tax Foundation. This is an issue he cares passionately about. And if you read the report, which is about 20 pages, he does not refer back to prior legislative attempts. He just talks about the idea in theory and the money it could raise. This is not a popular position in Washington, D.C. There has been one member of the House on the Ways and Means Committee, I think his name is Randy Pfingstag from Iowa, who's talked a little bit about this. But I think this is simply bad staffing. I think if Randy Pfingstag actually knew what he was proposing, he would stop talking about it. Once you start to go after, one kind of sector, the other sectors get scared. And let me tell you from personal experience, with the credit unions hike the hill, you fall in line fast. And last slide I have up here is, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's kind of amorphous. We tried to game out what could happen under different election scenarios for different issues that we are either monitoring, advocating for, playing defense on. And I'll say, under the only scenario in which the PCAOB is fundamentally overhauled and consolidated into the SEC is where you have a Republican trifecta. The Democrats don't have a lot of interest in doing that. Essentially, it would be shrinking the size of government. That's not really a Democratic position. And it's not something that legislatively they've really cared about. So it is possible, however, under a Republican trifecta. I think of interest that you see some areas of potential bipartisan cooperation. I see this in legislation that takes on China. There's been a lot of bipartisan cooperation on that in the last few years. There's a lot of bipartisan interest in digital asset taxation and regulation. My close friend, Jen Brown, who works for Senator Schumer as his banking counsel, is working on a bill right now on cryptocurrency that could pass by the end of the year. And I think there's actually a lot of opportunity around STEM legislation. I think you guys know that we have a bill in the STEM area that would basically designate accounting as STEM. And we feel really good about its prospects under any kind of election outcome. So with that, I'm at about 40 minutes. I think we have about 10 to 20 minutes left. I'm happy to answer questions. No question is off limits. So feel free to fire away.
Any questions? There's a lot going on, and thank you very much, Lauren. That was incredibly comprehensive, but you handled it in a fantastic way. So we usually have a fairly vocal group. Who would like to be the first to ask a question this morning? Well, I'm going to ask one because as a former full-time lobbyist, we used to have a pool at election time, all the lobbyists on our team to guess who would win. And the funny thing was, in our office, other people would participate. And it was usually not the lobbyists who won because we were so close and we had certain people we wanted to win. I think oftentimes we voted with our hearts instead of our minds in terms of who would make my job easier or type of thing. Curious, with everything that's going on now, as you said, it has been a really big switch and a quick one. And I think more of a change than most people anticipated. So just curious, in terms of the buzz on the Hill now, where are they leaning in terms of what might be the outcome of the election?
So I think Democrats are feeling really good about winning the White House. They are feeling pretty good about winning the House. And they have resigned themselves, this is in private discussions, to either losing the Senate or, in their best case scenario, the Senate breaks down 50-50, and then Tim Walz, like I said, has to cast the tie-breaking vote on a lot of legislation. John Tester, who is the current senator from Montana, he's a Democrat, he's a great member of Congress and a really nice guy, and does well for Montana. He has a really tough opponent in that race. And that is a state that has gone, I think voted for Trump overwhelmingly in the last presidential election. The polling consistently out of Montana has shown that Tester is in trouble. And then meanwhile, the polling in Ohio, where current Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown is running for re-election and was seen as someone that could be unseated, has shown that Brown's doing really well compared to Bernie Moreno, and has been outpolling him and by 8, 9, 10 plus points consistently. So when I look at the trajectory of those polls, and I see that John Tester is not doing well in Montana and Sherrod Brown is doing well in Ohio, even though they're both in red states, I think, oh, okay, John Tester's, he might lose. In which case the Democrats have to win every single seat in order for it to break down 50-50. Senator Schumer said today he thinks that the Democrats have a really good chance of keeping the Senate majority. I think that's wishful thinking. But Jackie Rosen is doing better than expected in Nevada. I think Bob Casey is actually blowing out his opponent in Pennsylvania. So there's reasons for Democrats to be hopeful. But this was 2 months ago, a month and a half ago, I would have agreed with the Republicans who said they were going to run the table. So yeah, it's been wild.
Wow.
It's been really volatile.
Wow. Mark, you've got a question.
Yes, hey, Lauren. I actually have two questions. So my first question is, I get the impression that Kamala Harris is going to just inherit all the policies that were Biden's policies, and that includes the no tax increases on individuals making over 400,000. But I never got a clear grasp of what that meant. Was that 400,000 per person, or 400,000 per couple, or is it 800,000 per couple? And is that total income or adjusted gross income or taxable income? That's my first question.
It's a great question, and I'll answer it. In 2012, Obama made a similar pledge, and it was 400,000 individuals, 450 for married filing jointly, I think. So I think Kamala has kind of boxed herself in here, because if that was the deal that Obama, or if that was the pledge that Obama took in 2012, I would argue that 400 grand in 2012 is very different than 400 grand today. And maybe she could still increase that, right? Like, this is a campaign pledge. She is proposing, much like former President Trump is proposing, they are proposing a lot of things that aren't rooted in reality are not really going to come to fruition legislatively. You got to remember that when Kamala entered the Senate, she was running for president from day one. So when folks ask me about her policies, I like to level set and remind them she's campaigning. She's always been campaigning, and policies are very different when they go from the campaign to like being translated into actual text. But Mark, I don't actually know the answer, and I am also personally and professionally curious. My guess is that it's a $400,000 threshold on both individuals and married filing jointly. I think that could get nudged up a little bit, particularly as folks start to take a deeper look at what happened in 2012 and what might need to happen again under divided government. And on what you said about her inheriting a lot of the policies, it's going to be really interesting to see what staff she chooses to keep on from Biden's team, and where she pulls staff from if she wins. And I could see kind of in the tax and financial services world, I could see Kamala Harris taking a lot of people from Elizabeth Warren's team, former team members. There's a man that I know named Bharat Mamaturi. He's a former Warren banking staffer. He's worked under Joe Biden in the White House, I think on the NEC or the Economic Council. There's just sometimes people is policy, and it'll be fascinating to see who she brings on board if she does win.
Okay. And for my second question, you talked earlier about the House bill that passed in January. It recently failed in the Senate. I had been holding quite a few tax returns on extension for the possible change in the bonus depreciation, maybe retroactively going back to 100%. Is that completely doomed from happening before September 15th extended deadline, or is there still a possibility that might get through?
My boss, Mark Peterson, hates when I make predictions, but I love to do it. It's completely doomed. There's no way it's happening before September 15th. And I say that as someone who is close friends with Schumer's banking counsel, who, sits next to his tax counsel. Again, there's a possibility that you could have a smaller tax deal come together at the end of the year. I would be so shocked if that and the other two business tax provisions were included in that, because I think everyone's like, let's just wait until the elections, see who holds the power in DC and by how much, and then we will address those provisions and a child tax credit, at some point next year in 2026. I also want to say, just as like a fun insider baseball stuff, Senator Crapo, who is the ranking member on the Finance Committee and who came out early against the Wyden-Smith bill, has become incredibly irritated with interest groups and lobbyists around town who have been demanding that he pass and support the Wyden-Smith bill. And the Crapos have a list of interest groups and lobbyists that they will no longer interact with. So lobbying too hard on the package is actually harming some folks' chances of getting in the room in 2025, particularly if Republicans control the Senate.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So we have one person that's following up a bit on what you and I were discussing earlier in terms of how you think things may go, or what are people talking about, and just indicated that with Tester likely to lose, how does anyone think that the Dems can control the Senate? I think that you went through that with the different races. But he says, do you have anything additional to add there?
It's just that, so Joe Manchin is retiring. He's the Democratic senator from West Virginia. That seat goes Republican right away. He's the only Democrat who held and was able to hold that seat. So assuming that West Virginia goes to the Republicans and you look at the remaining races, John Tester could lose in Montana, but every other Democratic senator or candidate for the Senate would have to win the election or their re-election in order, and Kamala Harris would have to win the White House. So in the event that you have a 50-50 Senate, a Democratic House, Kamala Harris in the White House, Tim Walz becomes the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, and you have a Democratic majority, a slim one, but you've got the Democratic majority and the Democratic trifecta. And I just pick on John Tester because right now he's looking like the weakest Democratic candidate.
Thank you. Does anybody have any additional questions? I don't see any hands, and looking in the chat, or the things that are being sent to me, there are more comments at this point. So hold on. All right. I think that's it. So again, if you have any additional questions, sorry, I'm peering at my chat box. Is there any additional questions, or are there any additional questions at this point? Well, I'm going to say thank you again, Lauren. I really enjoyed your presentation. You have great insight. I always like to hear from somebody that's up there and working on it, as opposed to, people that comment on it but aren't there, because so much happens behind the scenes that if you're not boots on the ground, you just don't see. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us this morning. I greatly appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Oh, one new message is this one.